Well, welcome back. I hope you had a lunch break. I hope you managed to grab something warm and nutritious in the 40-minute slot. And welcome back to part 2 of the SEND Across School Conference 2020. I'm very pleased to have, if your screen set up the same way as me, just below me, Professor Adam Boddison, who's going to address you with hopefully a quite interesting, thought-provoking speech over the next half an hour. Just some quick words from me. Adam is the Chief Executive of, is it NASN or NASN? Or do you not mind? NASN, the National Association of Special Education Needs, I'm sure you know. And he has responsibility for strategic direction and operational delivery. And he's also the chair of the Whole School SEND Consortium, which is leading on the delivery of the government's SEND school workforce contract. I think that's right to say. If it's not, I'm sure Adam will tell me. So that's probably enough for me. We're just letting the last few people in from the waiting room. So if you've missed anything, it's only me, so don't worry about that. I'll be quiet and give the floor to Adam. Adam, if you'd like to give us your keynote presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me to talk to you here today. I've got two kind of fairly chunky topics really to talk about. One, the future of SEMH, and the second one to do with the SEND review and what we hope might come out of that. So I'll try and do both justice in the time that we've got, but feel free to ask any questions in the chat as we're going along. I'll try and address those as we go through, and obviously there'll be a bit of time at the end for questions as well. Thanks very much for the kind introduction. If you're not already following myself and NASN on Twitter, please do. We share lots of useful information about SEND and about what's going on, not just from NASN, but from across the sector. And feel free to tweet at me after the session as well, if there are other thoughts, comments, questions, and things you wanted to discuss. Okay, so just to set a bit of context before I get into the SEMH issue really, first of all, it's worth just looking, I think, at how the profile of SEND has changed over time. So this data is pulled together from the January census data that's taken each year and published in July. So the most recent version obviously published in July this year, 2020. And I think what's interesting here is that you can see that in 2010 there was a peak in the overall proportion of pupils with SEND in schools, and then it started to drop off, and that drop off was due to well, three things. One, a change of government. Two, a change of the funding mechanism, which meant that essentially schools no longer received more funding if they had more pupils with SEN. And then also there was an Ofsted report called "A Statement Is Not Enough," which essentially said, schools, we think you're over-identifying the number of pupils with SEND. So that saw a drop-off then, and then we see that drop-off further again in 2014 when the Children and Families Act came in, and it's gradually started to creep up. I think what's really interesting about this is that if you look at the orange line at the bottom, that's the proportion of pupils who would have had statements and now EHC plans. That stayed absolutely steady at 2.8% until the last few years, where it started to really increase. And we've heard a lot about pressure on high needs funding and so on. Some of that is because of that increase there. But more interesting here is that all of the change, if you like, or the vast majority of change in the profile has been due to the non-statutory end. So the 80% of pupils with SEND, which is more than 1 million pupils who are now at the SEN support level. And one of the things I talk about a lot is the fact that we need to not forget that SEND is not just those with education, health and care plans, but it is those with SEN support as well. And that's a group that I think have not been as well focused on in the last 5 years as I think they ought to have been. Just worth showing the raw numbers here as well, because of course the actual pupil population has been growing over time as well. So you can see since 2016 that real steady increase in the proportion of pupils with SEND, and that's what's putting a lot of pressure on local authority budgets and provision, and also what's happening in schools, because actually the overall number of schools and the resource allocated from local authorities hasn't necessarily kept pace with those changes. Okay, just in terms of SEMH and getting onto that kind of social, emotional, mental health area, I wanted to share this graph here, which is from the Timpson review of school exclusions. And there's a lot of things in that review, and this is a graph which I don't think got as much attention, as much attention as it deserved. So essentially what this graph is an odds ratio graph, and it looks at how many more times likely you are to be permanently excluded if you've got a particular type of need compared to if you had no need at all. So this horizontal black line here, which is at the number 1, is kind of the benchmark, if you like, which is if you've got no SEN at all, no identified SEN. And then the blue bars are how many more times likely you are to be permanently excluded if you have that particular type of need. And what I'm interested in is this group who don't have EHC plans. And it's the big 4 here, the big 4 blue bars. And it's interesting to see that 2 of those, one of those is social, emotional, mental health, which is one of the reasons why it's so important that we get this right. But the other one, behavioural, emotional and social difficulties. Now those 2 things together obviously are all around that area of SEMH, and it just shows that if we don't get it right in that space, there's a direct line, if you like, from those with those types of needs ending up being permanently excluded if we fail to get that right. So it's just what it just flags, I think, how important that is. The other thing that's important here is that the other 2 biggest areas, SEN type not recorded and no specialist assessment of SEN. And the reason I point that out is because there is an issue here around, for some pupils, where the needs have not been accurately identified at the beginning, and that's also leading to exclusions. So it's something that we need to keep an eye on. In terms of what that looks like at the moment across the 4 broad areas, you can see here social, emotional, mental health, more prevalent in secondary than primary. Probably not a surprise, but you can see there just how big a proportion this is. So we're talking about 1 in 5 pupils pretty much with SEN who have this as a primary area of need. And this has grown quite significantly over the past few years. And again, you can see at the end here the proportion with no specialist assessment that I mentioned a few minutes ago. So a few statistics here around social, emotional, mental health, particularly with young people. So 1 in 8 of 5 to 19-year-olds has had at least 1 mental disorder when assessed in 2017. That's from NHS Digital. Half of mental ill health starts by age 15, 75% develops by age 18. Why do I mention that? Because that shows, I think, just how important it is that we are intervening and putting the provision in place at the kind of school age point of the journey, not waiting until they get to adulthood in that sense. And then lastly, 1 in 4 11 to 16-year-olds who have some kind of SEMH have actually self-harmed or attempted suicide. Pretty shocking statistics, really. So the consequences are severe if we don't get this right. Thinking specifically about schools now, one of the things I'm concerned about going forward is who is actually going to be responsible for leading on children's mental health and well-being in schools, because there is this requirement now to have a mental health lead that came out of the green paper that came a year or 2 ago. Obviously, the SENCO has responsibility for the 4 broad areas of need, which includes social, emotional, mental health. You know, some schools have access to a school nurse. There's an element of safeguarding, as we've just heard, around the self-harming and so on. So you've got lots of people there who are going to be involved in this in some way. And my worry is that that means that for some children, they fall through the cracks of the system somewhere. So I think it's really important that we establish who's going to have that coordination role. And for me, the obvious person, you won't be surprised to hear me say this, is the SENCO. So yes, there should be a mental health lead, but I would like to see that role, if you like, feeding into the overall coordination role that the SENCO has. And for me, it reinforces the point that was made in the SEND Code of Practice 2015, that the SENCO should be on the school leadership team. And I think that would legitimise this kind of structure that I'm talking about. A question I suppose I've got about what might happen post the SEND review is whether social emotional mental health will actually remain in the Code of Practice. Now, I'm not suggesting here that I have any inside information that it won't be in there, but I think it's really interesting that the more it becomes about addressing a health need, you know, the more people will start to ask the question, is it right that it's dealt with by education professionals in the school? And the analogy I sometimes use is, you know, you wouldn't go to your GP for help with your times tables, you know, because that's not their area of specialism. So maybe this mental health lead is going to pick that up and is going to be developing that area of specialism. But I do think we've got to watch carefully about what happens there, and particularly about how it fits with the wider code of practice. Second point around SEMH in schools is the extent to which curriculum expectations and accountability measures actually help children's mental health and well-being. There's obviously a reason why there have been these challenges which are becoming more acute for children over time, and there's quite a clear correlation, I think, between the accountability expectations that have been put on schools and the increase in pupils having mental health and well-being challenges. And yes, those accountability measures are on the staff and the workforce rather than the children. But I do make this point at the bottom here about if you've got a stressed workforce and a workforce that's under pressure, there's bound to be, I think, some into the social, emotional and mental health in schools. I think we do have to think about the workforce as well. And that's a point I'll come back to in the context of the pandemic in a moment. So just thinking about, obviously, post-pandemic, we know that pupils will have had this period of time at home, and for some of them that will have been you know, really great, and they would have gotten really well there. But for a lot of pupils, that will have been really hard. You know, the isolation of not seeing other children, perhaps being at home when families are stressed because of losing jobs and all kinds of pressures of being in an enclosed space altogether for extended periods of time. So I think there will be needs in the pupil population, but of course we know that our teaching workforce will be anxious as well, particularly because, you know, schools have remained open during the pandemic, and actually teachers, a lot of them have been putting themselves at great personal risk to make sure that happened, particularly for the most vulnerable. So there is that anxiety within the workforce that I think we need to address really openly. And I was at a meeting yesterday permanent arrangements in place to help with the kind of day-to-day stresses and strains of those jobs because they are so acute. And I do wonder whether we need to think about what we need for our education workforce at the moment as well. I've talked about exclusions already. The other thing we see in, of course, at the moment is a big spike in elective home education, and some of that. So even if those pupils end up coming back into school once everything gets back to some kind of normal, actually we might see a kind of secondary wave of SEMH needs coming back into our schools then as well. Moving on to the SEND review, and again, I just qualify everything I'm saying here, which is that I'm not on the SEND review team. I don't have any inside information at all, but these are things that I hope that the SEND review will address when it's published. So the first one to me is that it would be quite easy for a SEND review to focus solely on education, and if it's really going to have meaningful and impactful change, I think it has to be much broader than that. And yes, it'd be obvious to say health and social care, but I think it's even broader again. So we need to be thinking about long-term outcomes, so employment, so the Department of Work and Pensions, for example, it needs to be funded properly, so the Treasury needs to be involved. So I hope this is a broad review, which actually reaches across all areas of government and is not just confined to the education space. What gives me confidence is that the SEND review is happening in alignment with the comprehensive spending review. So the fact that that's been delayed actually might be useful because, you know, I think there are obviously options in there where there could be kind of a tinkering, if you like, with the current arrangements to kind of improve it a bit, or they could do something really radical. If they do something really radical, that is going to require funding, and without question more funding is needed now. I do think there's something around the existing funding, making sure that's spent appropriately and well, but definitely more funding is needed. So some of the considerations, I've got a few on this page and a few on the next page. First thing I hope is that we can do something about the fact that local authorities, not through any fault of their own, but they're in a position at the moment where they both identify the thresholds at which you can access provision, but they are also the commissioners of that provision. And that puts them in a conflict of interest situation where the more need they identify that goes over a particular threshold, then the more it costs them, and local authorities can't afford to pay for a lot of this provision. So that's created a lot of the issues, I think, and I would like to see those functions separated out. And I do have some views on how we might do that, which I can come back to later if people want to know about that. Funding I've talked about, but I do think there are geographical variations, and that's to do with historic funding formulas and so on. But there are also anomalies in the system to do with kind of types of settings. So, for example, you could have the funding model for special schools and the funding model for mainstream schools in terms of the amount of base funding and then kind of top-up funding, for want of a better word, that you get is quite different. But actually, for some pupils, you know, they're going to make a choice about whether they want to go to a special school or a mainstream school. That choice shouldn't impact the level of provision and the resource that provision needs. So it's a bit of an anomaly, and I'd like to kind of, instead of thinking of it as a special school, a mainstream school, an alternative provision, I'd like to see us thinking about that as one continuum of provision where the funding and the resource is almost irrespective of the type of setting you happen to go to. And as part of that, by the way, I was really pleased when the government wrote off the historic deficits for NHS trusts during the pandemic. I think they should do the same for high needs funding for local authorities, because at the moment, whenever more money comes in to local authorities, a lot of it doesn't end up reaching the end destination, if you like, of the pupils and the schools and other provision, because it's being used to plug gaps. And I've got some data I can show you on that shortly. Accountability, I talked about funding, but for me, the SEN notional budget, there are huge debates about what that is and if it exists or doesn't exist and what does it mean because it's notional and so on. For me, there's a really clear alternative, and we look at the way that pupil premium funding is used by schools and the way in which governance accountable for the impact of that spend. There is an obvious mechanism there to do the same with the SEN notional budget, and that would give the same status to pupil premium and SEND, where there is actually quite a lot of overlap. Other things, co-production. So this is working with parents and families in a meaningful way so that they are equal partners in this. The code and the Children and Families Act, I think, were really clear that they wanted that to happen, but it's not happening. And it's not happening because of a whole range of reasons, and one of those is to do with resource and systems and processes. So I think we either need to be honest about the fact that actually that's really hard to do, and when, you know, we've got an ambition and we'll get as close as we can, but we might not get there. That's not my preference, by the way, but I think it's better than over-promising and under-delivering. Or even better, let's be bold. Let's say, actually, we really want co-production to work, and then we fund it and resource it properly to make sure it happens. There are some questions around whether we should have a national education, health and care plan template rather than the slightly different variations of it all over the country. I think that's a good idea. There's some debate around the extent to which that allows you to personalise provision, but it's certainly worth thinking about. I think we need to look at the universal and ordinarily available provision in schools. I heard somebody talking about this a few weeks ago who I shared a platform with, and I thought it really made sense, which is if you actually have a minimum expectation in terms of what ordinarily available provision looks like for SEN for all schools, I think that will help to everybody to be clear about what they should be doing and what they can expect to access. The risk, I think, around that obviously is that everybody goes to the minimum expectation rather than the best practice expectation. My view on that is that school leaders actually want to do the right thing for these pupils, and so I think it's just setting out what that minimum looks like, and then we can start building that up. The recent Education Select Committee review into SEND called for a calculation to be done as to what it would cost to have a full-time SENCO for every school funded by the department. I think that's a really excellent idea. I haven't seen that calculation yet, but I hope that's underway. And then the last thing I'd say is just something to look out for, and it's something a colleague of mine that did some work on this, was that for some children, as I say, they've coped well during the lockdown period. And there's an argument now that because they were able to access education better, that blended offer, that remote offer, could possibly be considered a reasonable adjustment under the Equality Act going forward. And if that was to happen, that could change the face of education as we know it, not just for children with SEND, but for children in general. Okay, this was just the data I promised to show you around the pressures on high needs funding, and this is from the National Audit Office report into SEND spend, as I like to call it, which shows in red the number of local authorities who have overspent on the high needs funding block, and you can see that's gone up every year, and the blue is those that have underspent. Now, the latest data here is 17-18. I suspect it's virtually every local authority in the country now that is overspending on this area, which again just reinforces that point about writing off the high needs funding deficits. A few resources which may be useful. So these are funded by the Department for Education and coordinated through the work of the Whole School SEND Consortium. They're specifically to do with the return to school following the pandemic, and they're all available on the SEND Gateway website, so you can see the address there. I would encourage you to go and have a look on there, because there is a huge volume of really useful and, more importantly, freely available resources there that are well worth a look. Just returning to mental health first aid before I finish, one of the things that NASON does is we do have an accredited programme, accredited by Mental Health First Aid England, which is specifically around young people's mental health and looking at the first aid of that. And it works on the concept that you've got physical first aiders, and you should have mental health first aiders as well. So again, well worth having a look at that on the NASON website if that's something that you think could be of use for your school. Right, I'm going to stop there because that was a rapid barrel. I'm very happy to take questions. There may well be certain things that you want me to talk about in a bit more detail. So thank you very much. And I'm just looking at the chair. Should I switch the share screen off and come onto video now? Is that the best thing to do?
Yes, I think so. Then we can see you in your full glory. That'd be great.
Okay, bear with me.
And if people have questions, if they could indicate in the chat, or perhaps even unmute themselves if they're prepared to go first in front of 109 other people, that'd be absolutely great. I can see can you see the chat as well, Adam?
I can, yeah. Do you want,
okay.
I can see a couple of questions. Do you want me to start?
No problem me reading out if you can say, yeah, I mean, yeah, you may want to pick up some of those while people are thinking.
Yeah, so someone's just posted a question, which is, when is the SEND review due? So a really good question. It was originally supposed to be due in autumn, and of course this is the politicians' autumn, which I think runs from September to July or something like that. So so originally it was due in autumn. Yeah, thank you. Originally it was due in autumn of this year. Of course, the pandemic, in fairness, did delay some of that, and I would much rather they take a bit longer and they get it right than they rush to get it out. So I think that's fair enough. The word that seems to be coming out of ministers and out of the department is that the review has been elongated, which is a nice ministerial word for us there. But the timing now is that, as I understand it, something is going to go to ministers quite shortly. So if not this side of Christmas, I think not long afterwards. There is then quite, I think, a complex kind of sign-off process internally for these things, particularly if I think it's going to call for kind of significant expenditure, which I hope it will. So I think we're looking, to be honest, at probably after Easter and before summer, before it actually appears in the public domain in any kind of meaningful sense. So someone's commented on the mental health first aid course and saying it's well worth doing. Yes, thank you. I agree with that. Blended learning has worked so well for some pupils, and we need to know we're not going to get challenged by Ofsted over this creativity. Yeah, I think it's a really good point. I think the one thing I would say about that is, if we look at special schools, the proportion of special schools that secure good and outstanding outcomes has for a long time been not a lot higher, but consistently higher than it has for mainstream schools. And a lot of those special schools do have quite different approaches and quite creative and unique approaches, to use your language, in terms of how they deliver that work. And that does include blended learning and remote learning in some instances as well. And certainly for some pupils where they're spending a lot of time off site because they're accessing therapeutic support or medical support and so on. So why do I say that? Special schools are inspected under the same framework as mainstream schools, and so that gives me confidence that that actually the framework itself should not be a barrier. And I think I would hope that gives you the confidence, if you like, to push forward with what you know is right. And if there's one thing I could say about the new Ofsted framework, I think more than any other framework that we've seen before from Ofsted, it really sends a strong message that no school should be able to be graded outstanding unless they can also demonstrate that they're inclusive. And I would think if you can frame the offer that you've got there as being to include pupils and give them what they need, I would think you're on pretty solid ground with the new framework.
A couple of other questions you picked up, one about health being involved in education, health and care plans.
Oh yeah,
yeah,
it's a good question. It's a good question, and to be fair to the Department of Health, I think they did acknowledge a couple of years ago that they were. I think the phrase was "late to get on the bus" was the phrase I heard in a meeting a couple of years ago. So I think they've acknowledged that, but there are still issues, and some of those issues are not to do with a lack of willingness, but it's a lack of joined upness. I've never met a health professional or an education professional who says, I'm going to go to work today and give a bad deal for children with SEN. I just don't think that happens. But equally, if I was to talk to the clinical commissioning group lead in a particular local area, and I was to talk to the director of children's services in that same area, and I was to say, how many pupils are there with special educational needs and disabilities in this area? I don't think I would get the same answer, because they're not looking at exactly the same group. Yes, there'll be some overlap, but it's not exactly the same. And it's that lack of joined upness at that strategic level, which is why it's still not working right. So in answer to the question, how do we get health to truly get involved? I don't think it's just down to health. I think it's down to all of those strategic leaders to actually just get their heads together and make sure they're all on the same page. Because once they're on the same page, that will filter through the system.
Yeah. What about pressure groups there at the end?
Yeah, I'm just reading that one. So how involved and active are pressure groups such as NACE and Engage and SFLSE with regard to influence the outcome of the consultation? Well, I'm not sure that I would describe NACE as a pressure group. But I take the spirit of the question. I think the Department for Education, probably more than I've known in the past 5 years that I've worked with them around the SEND area, are being as more open and transparent about this than perhaps they have been in previous versions of this type of process. My worry is actually not to do with the Department for Education and the influence in that space. It's what I was saying earlier on about the wider bits of government, because I think the Department for Education kind of gets this. I think I'm not saying they've got the solution right, but I think they understand the problem and they understand the nuances of the problem. In order to get it right, though, as we said before about health, as we said before about social care, and I've talked about DWP and so on, where the pressures and priorities might be different and the drivers are different. It's how do we, because all the groups you've talked about there, I think all engage very closely with the Department for Education. I suspect they engage far less with some of the other areas of government that are not naturally associated with their day-to-day work. And that's the bit we've got to do if we really want to kind of make an impact and make a difference going forward, and really get the consultation to where it needs to be.
I remember that quote about two nations separated by a common language, and I think education and health certainly feels like that sometimes. They see the same things, they don't quite speak in the same way about it. So it's getting all that to join up, isn't it?
I think that's fair. Is the SEND review looking at the paperwork with regards to the admin attached to it? I'm thinking now by that you're talking about the bureaucracy that sits around the needs assessment process. Well, I hope it does. I mean, and the point I mentioned earlier on about having a standardised EHCP template, for example, would go some way to addressing that. But I think you're also referring to way before we even get to the point of a plan, the kind of cycles of evidence and things that you have to collect. It is highly bureaucratic, but where does that come from? That comes from a place of local authorities not necessarily having the funds to be able to put the provision in place, and it's effectively a stalling tactic. Forgive any local authorities that might be in the room, but I don't blame them necessarily. I think they are the levers of the wider system, but that shouldn't stop. We shouldn't have system issues and funding issues preventing provision getting to those people who need it, because every day, every week, every year that provision's not in place, it costs a lot more than that in terms of long-term outcomes for those young people. So that, you know, we can't have that really.
Really running close to the end of the session. So there's one there about can we get a fully funded non-class-based Senko? How likely do you think that is?
I don't know the answer to how likely it is. I think what I would say is, because it's not just, you know, me, Adam from Nason saying that. Actually, you know, Robert Halfon, as chair of the Education Committee, has actually called for that to be properly looked at in terms of what would the cost be to do something like that. I know that the National Senko Survey, that I'm one of the team of people that does that has frequently called for that. And that Senko role is pivotal. And I talked about this in an event I was at a couple of weeks ago, and there wasn't one person in the room who said it was a bad idea. So it's one of these things which is a good idea. Lots of people are asking for it. It'll come down to the money. And this is why we've got to get the Treasury really bought into the fact that there's an economic argument for this. Investing now, you know, the SEMH stuff I was talking about before, you invest now and get it right now, that will actually save bags of money in the future, way more than what we spend. The evidence for that is very, very clear. Whether that will mean they commit the spend, who knows?
I think it's one of those sessions we could quite happily keep going for another couple of hours and still reach too many conclusions. I think taking the first part is, should there be a National Education Health and Care Plan template? And somebody is going to speak to Layla Moran, who's the Lib Dem Education Shadow Minister, I suppose. What would your message be to her? So do you want to take those two together? And
yeah, very happy to do that. Yeah, in terms of the national template, yes, I think it would solve the problem. The critics of a national template will say, but does that mean you're kind of suggesting a one-size-fits-all rather than personalised provision approach? My response would be, if we've got a template where it ends up being a one-size-fits-all, then it's not a very good template. I think we should be able to produce a template which actually allows sufficient scope for the nuance and personalised provision. In terms of Layla Moran, if I was going to ask her to push in any one area, I think that if she could join the voices of those people who are pushing for that full-time Senko funded in every school, I think that would make a big difference.
Yeah, funding is always the answer to a multitude of things. We're right out of time. I know other people will have questions. I think we've covered just about all of the ones in the group chat. If we missed yours, I'm really sorry. Do email us at NHC, or we'll pick them up with Adam direct. Just leaves me to say thank you, Adam, for a great and stimulating, thought-provoking session.